Martin is our first panelist. Scott is Vice President of On-Time Edge, in addition to his capacity over at Nimble Leader. Scott aligns manufacturing execution strategies, connecting the dots between symptoms and root causes of current manufacturing throughput and profit performance. Scott, any additional thoughts you might want to share with the group?
Just, since 1983, I've been trying to provide solutions to and for manufacturing companies. And over the last, I'd say, 25 years, the focus has really been around production planning and scheduling in both production and project management environments.
Okay, great. So Bob Jarvis is our second panelist. We all know that Bob wears many hats. He's president of Quality Enablement. Bob has held leadership roles with eBay, Barclays, JP Morgan, Six Sigma Master Black Belt. He's the creator of Workplace Agility, a proprietary technology assessing teams across 6 core dimensions, identifying gaps that get in the way of team agility when adapting to a high change market environment. It's really exciting stuff. Bob, any additional reflections from you?
A couple of things, because they tie in nicely with today's presentation, and it has to do with the why I got into this in the first place. And I have 2 pretty deeply held beliefs. One is that every one of us, regardless of where we are in an organization, ought to be able to go to work, do something meaningful that they actually enjoy, and leave at the end of the day feeling good about what they accomplished. And we'll see how that ties into what Scott's going to be talking about. And the flip side of that coin is that every company deserves to get the best that they can out of their return on investment in people. And we do that by getting stuff out of the way. And we're going to spend a lot of time today on Scott's side talking about how to make some of that happen.
Right. Okay, Jim Serra was our third panelist. Jim is CEO of Plan Together, a company that provides advanced scheduling and planning capabilities to manufacturers globally. Unfortunately, Jim's undergoing a medical procedure this morning, so he will not be joining us. We will, however, touch on his domain expertise during our panel session, this morning. And Jerry, I forgot you. Can you just take a 60-second, 30-second intro for yourself?
Sure. I work with Drew Orton at Nimble Leader. I'm a managing director, and my focus is on branding and marketing communications and putting a public face on the kind of positioning work that Drew does. And full disclosure, Scott McMartin is a client of mine at On-Time Edge, whom I met through Nimble Leader.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jerry. So let's begin with an opening statement. As we emerge from the pandemic, leaders across the globe are grappling with significant change impacting every part of their respective businesses. A recent BDO study identified disruption in the supply chain stability as a major cause of uncertainty for manufacturers. We're hearing that an awful lot these days. In our recent panel discussion conducted a few months ago with manufacturing leaders of 17 different companies, they echoed a common refrain. We have many moving parts coming together at once: drawings, materials, site conditions, employee turnover, all creating a great deal of complexity. Today's panel will explore how manufacturers might address some of these challenges. And so even before we begin, with the group, to the broader group, who thinks that effective scheduling causes stress within your own or client manufacturing shop floor environments? Any thoughts there? Anybody?
Probably more poor scheduling, I would think, would be the cause of the stress potentially.
Okay, poor scheduling. Anything else?
Just unanticipated things just throw in a lot of stress.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Scott, I keep hearing you talk about theory of constraints as a scheduling game changer. I mean, it's been kind of part of our discussion ever since we met several years back. And so you've talked about it. I guess a question for me is why should I care? Why should anybody care about that theory of constraints?
Well, I'd say the primary reason is that it truly is a game changer as we talk about it. I mean, it's simple. It's what I love about it most. It's very, very simple concept, common sense, essentially. And it does have the ability, and I can speak to it in at least in the 2 companies that I was responsible for the sales growth of the company. It literally transformed the company's ability to generate profits and more revenue in a very short period of time. So it's been something that's been around a long time. It's sort of been taking a back seat to other more popular initiatives. Lean in particular would be one. But, I find that it really is not in conflict with any of the continuous improvement tools or methodologies. And it's an opportunity, I think, for companies. And actually, one of the other benefits of it is that not many people actually are trying to leverage theory of constraints as a management strategy to gain a competitive advantage. So companies that do really can actually leapfrog, I think, their competitors. So it's a powerful but yet simple and effective way to help companies become unified around a common goal, create more throughput, create value, and kind of live up to the things that Bob was talking about. Go to work expecting to do good things and leave work happy that you did and looking forward to the next day.
Okay, so I really, when somebody says theory of constraints, I didn't know exactly what that means relative to the group. I mean, do you have an understanding of what Scott's referring to when he talks about theory of constraints, or do we need a little bit of an explanation there?
Let's go with an explanation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
what does that mean, Scott?
Yeah. So essentially, the idea is that every system, especially if it has dependent steps and variability from step to step, manufacturing process is a pretty classic example. They all have constraints and a limiting factor. The constraint for a manufacturer could be its market. Maybe they're not getting enough demand. The constraint to flow could be a resource inside the four walls of the factory. Or it could also be material availability or lack of material for that matter. So, but the idea is that every process that has dependency and variability has a limiting factor or a constraint or a bottleneck. And the idea would be to identify what it is, and then be honest about the fact that that is the limiting factor of what the organization can create or can create in terms of output. So it's really harnessing that basic concept. And then there are two other principles that really come to play. One of them is, how do I actually manage the flow through the constraint? And that we call the execution model to do that, drum, buffer, rope. The drum being the constraint. And the other concept is, if I can deliver on time to my customers, I really want to do that as profitably as possible. So there's another concept called throughput accounting that really, takes a shot at cost accounting as a way of helping day-to-day performance improve by ensuring that everybody on the shop floor or in management really understands how they're affecting the overall performance of the company.
Okay,
so go ahead.
So Scott, so I get the understanding relative to, we have constraints within your organization. They could be people restraints, it could be manufacturing restraints, wherever they are, there are restraints or constraints within the organization. And so you just said just a few minutes ago that I want to manage to that constraint. Why? Why do I care about managing to that constraint? What are the manifestations of doing that well?
Well, if you're managing the constraint rather than being a victim of the constraint, you're going to be in a more proactive environment, right? People who don't necessarily know what their capacities are, or they don't understand where the constraints might be in their organization, they're constantly in a position of, hopefully in a time of prosperity with regard to the market demand, they're overbooking their capabilities, which creates all kinds of stress. A lot of, I used to have one guy that I worked for told me at one time, when he saw a FedEx charge on the P&L, that was an indication that they weren't planning very well. They weren't executing very well. So the idea of utilizing something like theory of constraints to manage flow through a constraint is the idea of becoming more proactive about how to fulfill your promises to your customer. So it's a fact of life. There are constraints. Understanding what they are and knowing how to manage them properly just makes the organization perform better.
Okay, so it sounds good. Operating in a proactive environment. So I like to hear that. I'm putting my CFO hat on. I'm in the meeting and my eyes glaze over. show me why do I care about proactively managing? What are the tactical manifestations that I'm going to see within my business that would suggest that this is a good thing to do?
I guess what you mean by that is, if if you look at the classic manufacturing environment, there's a lot of firefighting, there's a lot of expediters. There's even people called expediters in manufacturing environments, and their job is to basically run around and make sure that whatever the squeaky wheel happens to be at that time is being addressed by material availability and those kinds of things. So I think it's a relatively high stress environment because those kinds of issues keep cropping up every minute. When you walk in the morning, the production meeting is generally, hey, what didn't happen, or what do we have to do, or what changed, and what's the priority today, and it constantly is changing. So that to me is a source of stress. Ordering things before you need to causes an elevation in raw material or work in process. Okay. Having to expedite material in or orders out to customers because you didn't plan or execute well, that elevates the cost structure quite a bit. Outsourcing because you haven't managed the constraint very well, you may have to outsource some of that work at a lesser margin. So, if the ultimate goal of the company is to generate net operating profit after tax greater than the cost of the capital used to create that profit, then it really is important to understand, how those capital assets are being utilized. And when to make greater investment, and possibly when to divest of some of those assets that you don't need or aren't using very well.
Okay, so I put my financial hat on. I think what I heard you basically say was, if I'm not managing effectively against the constraint, more likely than not, my working capital is going to go up, right? So I have more dollars tied up in short-term investment to manage my business over a period of time. That's one thing, which is negative. Then my expenses might be going up, as well, in terms of how I'm managing the business. And then thirdly, if I'm not really optimizing against that constraint, I could potentially be making fixed asset, additions to my plant base that aren't really necessary, that I don't really need, and so I'm really tying up dollars even further than that. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's typical, especially in smaller companies. There's a love affair with buying new equipment. We're going to put this new machine in, and they're going to justify it on the basis of cost per part. I can put a lot more parts through there, so it's actually cheaper to manufacture the product. And there's very rarely any post-mortem on the ROI on that investment. And there's really not even a great understanding of how the putting that into service is actually going to increase the net operating profit being generated by the firm. So, having an ability proactively to actually test the impact of that additional capital would be a really great asset for people.
Okay. All right. So the reality is, we talk about managing within a proactive environment, which is key, right? Being more efficient as an organization. What I'm hearing you say, there are really tangible manifestations, to not operating effectively, managing against that constraint. And they're very real, in terms of how I spend or utilize scarce resources at my disposal. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, Bob is probably right in the middle of kind of what ultimately happens, right? So if you're not really managing the company well that way, it seems that almost every company I go into is trying to brute force the performance goals that they have. Maybe I can get on time, but I'm experiencing all kinds of elevated operating expenses, like the ones I mentioned, expedited freight and outsourcing and overtime. And it's amazing when that chemistry starts to click, when you actually start to manage the business around what to be your constraints, all of a sudden everything just starts to take off, and there's actually more of a growth opportunity with a whole lot less effort, if you're doing that. So, yeah, go ahead.
So Bob, would you have any thoughts on what Scott just said?
Yeah, I do, because it gets back to both sides of the coin that I talked about. People want to produce, and they know when things are chaotic, and they know when the organization, in this case, the flow through the plant or the project, is chaotic, they know that there's problems and they get frustrated because they're not able to do what we're paying them to do. And to your earlier point, the other side of the coin, profitability for the company, either reducing expenses or getting things through faster. Both sides of the coin hurt.
Right.
And the other thing about the financial impact, Drew, the throughput accounting framework really helps to unify the organization. I can't tell you how many times I've walked into companies and they have these efficiency metrics like pounds poured per employee per month. Something like that has nothing to do with satisfying the market. You get to the end of the quarter and all of a sudden the pounds poured metric doesn't seem to be where it needs to be. What do? They go out in the yard, take, castings that they've already made, melt them, re-pour them, put them back out in the yard. But they've managed to a metric that has nothing to do with actually satisfying customers or increasing the overall value of the organization. So what happens a lot of times is different departments even have different efficiency metrics that are actually at odds with each other. So I find that the throughput accounting framework is really a great way to help unify the company. It's relative, again, it's simple. There's only 3 components to it. And everybody in the company at whatever level they might be operating at, whatever department they're in, understands exactly how any action or decision that they make affects those numbers.
Right.
And so I think that's a powerful thing when you start getting into the manufacturing world.
Okay.
Let me touch on that a little bit, Drew, if I could,
Yes.
also from the people side of it, from the agility side of it. Metrics is key. And to Scott's point, too often organizations have taken a spot approach to metrics. We've probably all been in situations as managers when our bosses said to us, I want you to collect the following metrics, A, B, and C. They've never explained the why. They've never understand what it's trying to accomplish. And I've always pushed back on those. The first question you ask when somebody says, I want you to do this metric or implement these metrics and track them is say, what's the business question you're trying to answer? And if they can't tell you what business question it is that they're trying to answer, then they're asking for bogus metrics.
All right.
And if they get to the point where they can do that, the next thing up is, okay, what business objective is coming from this question that's leading to these metrics? Because so often you talk to the guys who know and they'll say, well, the real question we're trying to answer is how do we, whatever it is, and someone who is on the shop floor in this case will say, well, A and B might help you with that. C is not going to give you any information, but metric D and E might give you everything you need. And now when people see the metrics on the shop floor, rather than embarrassing management because they know that it's the BS,
Right.
they can say, yeah, now we understand. Let's see what we can do to help meet those metrics because we know it will improve our delivery to our customers who we care about.
All right. And I think implied in that also, Bob, is that it's linked to culture of the organization. Other people have the freedom to be able to speak up and engage, right, on topics that are relevant to moving the business forward. So very, very, very key. So Scott, let me ask you this. All right. So you've talked about theory of constraints, but the title of this, is the power of balanced flow. How does the theory of constraints relate to that topic, balanced flow?
So as we talked, fundamental to the theory of constraints is the constraint, right? And so if I'm trying to actually manage the flow of material or work through the constraint, once it's been identified, so there's 2 other components of that. I talked about drum, buffer, rope a few minutes ago. The drum is the constraint or the control point. The buffer is essentially just an element of time that is usually placed before the constraints, so that work that has to be processed by the constraint can queue up a little bit. The idea is that if I manage the flow of material into that buffer, so if it comes in, and somebody will say, well, what size should the buffer be? The answer really is it doesn't matter. It's really a function of what do you sense is the degree of variability in the process. So if upstream of a constraint that happens to be in the middle of the flow, for example, maybe I want a buffer that's 3 shifts in size, 3 different zones, right? 8 hours each, 3 shifts. And if I find that, so that's the buffer part. The rope is actually the signal that releases material into the system. When you have a leaky faucet or you got something happen with your plumbing in your house, You don't turn up the volume of the flow of the material. You actually choke it off to find out what's going on, right? So the idea here would be to choke off the release of material into the system to be worked on. If the buffer size is correct, then most of that material will arrive, kind of in the yellow zone. Say if we have a green, a red, a yellow, and a red. Green being too early, red being kind of too late, yellow being kind of in the middle, right? If stuff keeps arriving at a higher percentage of the time in the red zone, that means you don't have enough time to react if something goes wrong. Let's say the material's bad. Let's say somebody doesn't show up for work to run that machine, or the machine goes down. So the buffer is really about protecting, the system against the typical variability, right? You could either protect against the 100-year flood or the 50-year flood, but whatever you decide, that's kind of what you're living with. So the idea is to synchronize the flow of material from suppliers into the building, up into and through the constraint, and then out to the customer. Okay. And so there are different techniques for doing that, but that's essentially what the balanced flow is. It's balancing the flow through the constrained resource. Many companies will try to balance capacity. And in a lot of high volume repetitive environments, that seems to be a little bit more of the urge. But in a high mix, low volume environment, which most manufacturers tend to be, the mix can change in an instant based on what the fickle marketplace wants to do. And if that happens and you've you've established a capacity, a balance of capacity around that type of product, when it changes, all of a sudden now the bottleneck or the constraint moves and creates all kinds of havoc. So the idea of the constraint is that it's something I can monitor, I can manage it. And as I start to see that it's being, that its capacity is being exceeded, I'll have a lot of lead time to actually elevate that constraint or, do something to address it. But that's the idea, is to manage flow through the constraint. And some companies would say, well, that's going to limit my throughput. And we would say it's actually going to increase your throughput by managing the known constraint.
Okay, so and you used the words earlier, choking off, choking off, and see that I guess if we talk about balanced flow versus balanced capacity, balanced capacity, choking something off seems counterintuitive and maybe counterintuitive to the prevailing mindset within most manufacturing environments. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but choking off meaning I want the flow of material to be equal to the consumption of the constraint. If I push more stuff in than the constraint can handle, then I've got the opportunity for people at other work centers to start cherry picking what they work on. Stuff can, lots of things can happen in terms of damage to the material. It simplifies the life of people on the shop floor if they know that things entering the system in a particular sequence are going to get processed by the constraint in that same sequence, and they're going to get shipped to the customer in the same sequence. That way they don't have to make any decisions, just work on what's in the queue.
Okay, but people might be averse to choking off. Correct me if I'm wrong. They might be averse to choking off, let's say, the flow because they're concerned about the other performance metrics that they're being held accountable to. Would that be true?
That's true. I mean, one of the things that we do is we take a look at metrics. What are the metrics? I mean, most companies are paying for the performance they're getting. I mean, they're bonusing people on things that are actually counter to the goal of the company. So we want to make sure that there's no disconnect or conflict in terms of departmental goals for sure. But even if it's a global goal that really is kind of at odds with trying to do good things for your customer or stakeholders or whatever, that's something that has to be identified right away. Because that could be so frustrating. I mean, Bob pointed out earlier, if you're telling somebody go do this, and tell me how somebody's measured, and I'll tell you what they're going to do. They're going to do what they're getting paid to do. So we want to make sure they're getting paid to do the right things. And, that's a fundamental in terms of increasing performance because we've now managed and maximized flow through the constraint.
Okay, so, on the surface, what we're talking about would seem like it's kind of tactical, but in many respects, it's incredibly strategic. If you don't address the strategic issues up front, then you're likely to continue with the same behavior. Any comments from anybody else in the group relative to what we're talking about here? I see some head nodding favorably. Yes,
Mike?
agreed. Yep, Mike.
Yeah, I think it's right. I agree with all of it, and to me, the real challenge is connecting, for example, in manufacturing, connecting with people on the shop floor in ways that they can translate what we mean by theory of constraint into something meaningful for them. Historical example, in a prior job, we demonstrated to folks that if we remove some constraints, using today's term, that we could actually reduce the amount of overtime that they work. This happened to be a group of people that really didn't want to work overtime. I mean, yes, the overtime people who loved overtime had plenty of overtime to work, but by and large, the group as a whole didn't want to work overtime. And when we were able to demonstrate that, hey, look, if we make these improvements in these areas, which were constraints at that time, we can reduce overtime. And over a 3-year period, we saw that overtime went from mandatory like every other week to mandatory once every 3 weeks to we went through a summer where we maybe had one mandatory weekend the entire summer. And all of that was removing constraints that were preventing the equipment from producing. And Scott's absolutely right. Oftentimes it's very minor things that can be done that can help reduce or remove the bottleneck, and you get more product out, and things start to get better for folks.
Right. Thank you,
Yeah.
Mike.
And just another aspect of that, Mike, was a lot of, like you said, a lot of people who start to depend on the overtime, right? It's part of their income. So you have to sort of do a little bit of prep work, saying, look, yes, you're going to lose the overtime over overtime, and we'll use it surgically to satisfy customers. But at the end of the day, we're going to generate more net operating profit, which you'll participate in. And a lot of times plant people don't like to hear about bonus systems because they never get the bonus, but they know they're going to get the overtime because it's a screwed up situation, right? So they're going to take advantage of it.
Yeah.
So there is work to be done to help people understand that if we can manage the flow better and generate more net operating profit after tax, we're going to have more to share with everybody else. And in one case where I was, after we implemented this, we went from 16 to 2-week lead times, and we went from on-time delivery of about 40%, which it baffles me how the company was even in business, to in the 90s. And we created the best profitability of the company's history, and for 8 consecutive quarters paid bonuses to everybody in the plant.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how powerful it can be.
Right. Really key.
I agree on the overtime thing. There's for an hourly person, the notion that if this thing stays as messed up as it is, I'm assured overtime. So the thought of improving it kind of puts their personal revenue. Yeah. And in my situation, the situation we had, we truly 80% of the group really didn't want to work overtime. They really didn't want to do it. But there were a couple of machines that we just needed to run, and for the folks that loved overtime, they were able to get it. But yeah, it's kind of cool.
Okay. So Scott, primary contributors to scheduling stress, what would some of those be in your mind?
Well, and again, this would be in both production and probably even more in the project world. But whenever you overload resources, you create stress. I mean, they're forced into a situation where they have to multitask. In a production world, they have to keep doing setups that are probably very costly. They're jerking around the production orders. Customer service is telling customer A on day 1, oh yeah, your order is going to be on time. It's going to be June 29th. The next hour, they get told, hey, go tell these customers their order is going to be late by, so that, that kind of, oscillating at, being the victim of the noise level in the company, overbooking the plant. So, going in every morning, we've got an issue. Who do we take care of and who do we not take care of? And that's always a struggle for, because most people they want to treat every customer equally, but we're sort of at a point where, everybody's equal, but some customers are more equal than others. And that has to be determined. And that's not something that's easy to do for a lot of companies. But yeah, so, and then in the project world, it's even more of an issue because this constraint really is the people. They're being, companies are going out there getting these projects. They have no idea what the load of that work is going to do, or even when it's going to strike, on the resources that they have. So, uncertain, goals and objectives, changing bonus systems and compensation. Very charismatic project managers going to the guys doing the work saying, hey, I need you to work on this. I know you're working on that, but come over here and do this. And, people are just sort of, being torn, a bunch of different directions, not really knowing who's right and wanting to satisfy everybody.
Scott, let me ask you this, because you use this, you were talking about this earlier, you said treating every customer equally. Now, that's kind of a comment that, if you put somebody up against the wall and said, should you treat every customer equally? They're going to want to say the right thing, right? And the answer probably coming out of their mouth is, yes, I want to treat every, customer equally. I think you're advocating maybe that is not necessarily the best path.
If you take orders without regard for capacity and you overbook yourself, either knowingly or unknowingly, decisions have to be made. It's not unlike, national healthcare type of stuff that you hear about all the time. Who's making the decision about who gets service and who doesn't, right? That's a thing that has to happen every day. But if you actually understand who your target market is, and you actually have set up a fulfillment mechanism that actually does satisfy, when you say yes to somebody, you can do it. Today, most companies, when they say yes to an order driven by some standard lead time, they don't know that they can actually deliver that on time. They just hope. Typically manufacturing systems look at material availability. They have a thing called available to promise. If I can get the material, I know I can get it out the door. Well, that's not true. And material is one thing, but capacity is another. When you overbook yourself, you create a situation that is untenable for most people, and eventually it wears them out.
Okay.
And then in
Scott,
environment. Yeah.
So if I hold to that point that you just raised, I'm not going to treat all customers equally. Some float to the top, some float to the bottom, right? And so there's an impact relative to how the organization operates or basically solves or addresses those customer needs, sales, whatever. What are the kinds of things I might do to move a customer from the bottom to the top?
Well, certainly, a customer that's profitable would be one that's going to get treated better.
Yeah.
Customers that are relatively stable in terms of their order patterns and their demands on the organization are probably going to get treated a little bit better. But looking at profitability of customers is really kind of the first step, because if I have to start to allocate my capacity to the best customers I have in terms of just purely profit, right? I mean, that's the goal of the company, generate net operating profit after tax greater than the cost of capital. First thing I would do is I look at every customer that I have in deciles. What 20% of my customers are generating 80% of my profits? And typically in most manufacturing operations, that's a pretty nice distribution. 20% do generate 80% of the sales and the profits. But when you start looking at the far right of that bar graph, you're going to see customers that don't generate any profit. Why would I give them a priority over some other customer? Now, I'm not going to go out and fire them necessarily right away, but I might raise their price just to get to the point where I can at least break even. I mean, we had a situation not too long ago. 30% of the customers of that company did not generate a single dollar of gross margin, positive gross margin. If they just stopped doing business with those guys, it would have put $1 million on the bottom line. And that's a $30 million company.
Right.
If they just raised their price to break to zero gross margin, they would have done the same thing. So you have levers that you can do, but you eventually want to either discourage those people from continuing to buy from you, but you now have to replace them with other customers that are profitable. But you better be able to deliver on time. You better be able to deliver faster than your competitor, and you got to do it making money.
Yeah, and that actually was a loaded question, Scott, and you kind of answered it, right? So if I identify that there are certain customers who are just not profitable, I mean, I think what I've found is that oftentimes when you go out there, they know that they're getting an incredible deal, and to either raise it up to basically a break even or more, they're not going to even bat an eye. And without a change in strategy, you could radically improve the profitability of your business in the short term, just by doing that. And that's an example where what's happening on the shop floor has a huge impact in terms of pricing, go to market, from a pricing strategy perspective, which can take a business down a whole different lane in terms of how they think and act as it relates to this particular topic.
Sure.
Yes, Bob.
Yeah, I just had, based on what you were saying, we focused so far on the impact sort of within the walls of the facility, the plant, the whatever, and how do we optimize that? But the reality is, talking about what you were saying earlier, Scott, where 10 o'clock in the morning, a customer gets a call, says, yeah, we're going to deliver to you on July 4th. And well, probably not July 4th, the holiday, but let's say July 10th. And then after lunch, they get a call, say, well, no, it's going to be the 15th. The external view, and we know that customers talk to each other. How you doing with your ABC company? Oh man, half the time they delay my orders. How about yours? Oh no, they always deliver to commitment. And companies cannot measure that, as Deming said, as both unknown and unknowable. Right. The insidious real cost of poor quality. The other thing that came to mind when you're talking about treating customers equally, part of the equality is when I give you a date, we'll meet the date. And I can imagine, and I'm not the expert, so I need your input on this, Scott, but I can imagine taking one of those to the right of that bell curve. They're not the 80-20 Pareto on the left, they're over on the right, but they're still profitable. Maybe we don't give them the date based on if we started today, but we make a much larger buffer, if you will, and that's probably not the right term, to say, we can probably commit to you 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later than we would have if you were on the left side of the curve, but we'll meet that date. Is that feasible? Because
So most companies operate with lead times that are probably 5 times the actual processing time of making the product. I was talking to a company the other day. They have a 4-month lead time right now, and they're just making a fabricated can basically. And it takes them about a day or two to actually make the product. So they say the total marketplace right now, the lead times are in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 months. So if we put in place this ability to execute like we talked about, and you can get closer to the actual processing time, and we generally ask the question, if your CEO were going to expedite the order, every machine was working, everybody showed up for work, and all the material was there, what would it take you to get it done? It's usually hours, typically, right? So let's say we quote a lead time of 2 months, 8 weeks. Now, you're going to be better than everybody else, so you're going to get business. Now, other people may try to beat your lead time, but they're not going to have the ability to execute against that lead time profitably. They're going to be doing expedited freight. They're going to be outsourcing. They're going to be doing all the things that cause you to lose money trying to satisfy the customer. Now, you can do it in a week. So you've got a 3-week window of opportunity, either for opportunity orders that come in that you can quote at a higher price, or a good customer that says, hey, I know I said the 15th, but I really need it on the 11th. You've got to build in to the system the opportunity to take advantage of your ability to execute faster and more reliably than the other guy. And my assessment right now would be that 90% of the manufacturers out there who are just using spreadsheets and ERP software to kind of do what they do, they are at risk of having people that really know how to execute take their business from them.
Right. Okay. All right, Scott, so we talked about contributors to scheduling stress. Let's kind of look at it from a multi-project environment. How is stress created there?
Same thing essentially. Company will go out and take projects, and I've had one company tell me they'll take a project no matter what, they're going to take it, even if they know they can't deliver it, just because there's so much variability in the overall project itself that they figure they're going to figure out a way to get it done. But it's the same thing. I'm now going to basically take on all this work, and now in a multi-project environment where the resources are shared, they're not part of a dedicated team. They're skilled resources that are working on multiple projects, and they might have 10 or 12 things to work on any given day. The question with it would be, which one do they work on first? And because of the high variability in a project environment to begin with, it would be, if they have even more than 2 things or 3 things to work on, knowing what sequence to work on them in is it's a crapshoot. They would never get it right. So again, not overloading yourself is fundamental. And then once you have a demand flow coming in, and you want to sequence that work in the proper sequence, so that the people doing the work know what to do. There shouldn't be the question about, what do I do? What do I work on? I want to have some structure to that. Now, there could be the odd time when I might work out a sequence, or I'm told to work out a sequence and it makes sense to do it. But for the most part, when you get a schedule for production, or you get a task sequence for projects, execute it as it's presented, and you'll find that everything will flow the way it needs to.
Right.
But those are the kinds of issues that you run into in project environments. Project managers, strong arming resources, the work is overloaded. The fact that they're only going to be successful 30% of the time is another source of stress. 70% of projects either are challenged or outright fail, and only 30% of them actually succeed. So if there's an inherent understanding about that, that's another source of stress in a project environment.
Right, so Scott, going back earlier in terms of the discussion, there's this notion of everybody assumes it's normal that we're going to treat all customers equally. And the reality is that's not the case. And actually that identification in my mind is basically a call to reflect. How do we make decisions, around who we're going to support, who we're not going to support? Similarly here, this idea that you raised up around shared resources versus dedicated resources, that seems like it's almost another point of reflection, right? Because if there's somebody out there who's charismatic and is able to get the resources, for their project, that's not really a good decision point, is that right? In terms of how that happens, so there might be a whole review, just around that particular topic, shared resources versus dedicated resources.
And it's very crucial. It's very critical that everybody in the organization understands what the company's trying to accomplish with any systems that it puts in place. I mean, whether they're manual or automated, there's a reason we're going to do these things, and that has to be articulated very clearly to all the people, especially if there's going to be changes to the way things are getting done. And they don't understand why. Bob asked, why are we doing this? What's the benefit of this? What's the cause and effect relationship? And if everybody understands that it does make some sense, and that we will be more competitive, we will have the ability to come back to our job tomorrow because we're going to continue to succeed at satisfying our customers, then I think it's a better environment.
Right. So Jerry, let me poke at you. So based on what Scott has said, why would somebody who is focused on branding, brand messaging, positioning, be interested in this conversation? How does what you do relate to what we're addressing here?
It's real simple. Brands are built on promises. And if you can't deliver what you promise, you have no credibility, or you'll soon lose all your business. And what excites me about this process is that it actually runs counter to a lot of people's assumptions about workflow. They think if everything's working fine and at full efficiency, they'll win. No, they'll potentially go out of business. because having everybody work all the time isn't the solution. And I think it becomes also a support point for your brand promise that you can overachieve the industry. It gives you a competitive advantage. You can outperform the average delivery times, production times, cycle time, the whole 9 yards. You can help your clients move faster, satisfying their clients. That's what really B2B selling is about. And I think this process helps support that. What's amazing is very few people are taking advantage of it in a way. We commissioned a study, we paid for a commissioned study and found out, and I don't have the exact numbers, but the investment in advanced planning and scheduling is rising immensely for software, but the implementation, et cetera, is not necessarily so successful. And the people who are actually using the principles of theory constraint are just a minor proportion of that. So what that's saying is there's a whole world of competitive opportunity out there for those people who bring on theory of constraints thinking to outperform the market, outperform their competitors, gain share, gain prominence, make more money. Isn't that the goal? Make more money?
And getting back to your point about the branding. So if you're competing on the basis of price, product, or service, there is a mechanism within the theory of constraint world to satisfy all of those fulfillment systems. Typically, the problem we run into is the customer, the manufacturer is trying to be all things to all people. They're trying to be the cheapest, the best at service, and the most innovative. And that's just not going to happen. So if they, if they are building their brand around service and they message that clearly, then the expectation will be that they will have short lead times. They will be on time, 100% of the time or pretty darn close to it. They might even offer guarantees. There's a company in Western Pennsylvania. If an order that they send out to a customer is late by a day, it's 30% discount on that order. If it's late about another day, it's another 10% or 20%. And then if it's late again, day after day, it's 10% more until the order is free. That's how confident they are about service delivery, right? If they're price competitive, then they're going to make different capital investments than the company that's trying to compete on service. And the company that's competing on product innovation is going to have yet another way that it hires people, the way that it executes on its value proposition. But, we can support all of those. The trick is, which one are they? And then how do we set the system up to essentially deliver on that value proposition?
Okay, so what I'm hearing is what's happening on the shop floor is not done in a vacuum. That there's a clear and direct linkage to the branding, to the messaging, to the communication, actually to the ability of a business to monetize that value proposition. Because if I'm able to get an effective 1 or 2 points increase in terms of pricing, that could dramatically impact the profitability and cash flow for the business. So really, really key. Any additional thoughts from anybody else, in terms of what we've just talked about here? Agree, disagree? I mean, please share your thoughts.
I just want to add one more thing to that. If you do that 80-20 thing, right? Those 20% of your customers that do 80% of your business, my question would be, why? Why do those 20% of your customers, are they just ridiculously stupid? They're going to pay you a premium for your products so that you can do business with all the rest of them. And they're going to have to sacrifice access to your capacity because you're trying to do business with people that don't really care about the value proposition.
Right.
So it would be interesting to ask those 20%ers, why do you buy from me? Is it because I'm the cheapest? Is it because I have the best service? Or is it because I have the best products?
Hopefully you know that answer.
Right, but
if you don't, then you absolutely do need to ask those questions.
Right.
Mark, did you want to add a comment or?
Well, I've been thinking as I've been listening to my exposure to manufacturing, and it's actually been a lot of it, even though I'm a marketing person. I got 2 years of experience on the assembly line, 2 summers in college. So it's kind of funny, if I think of myself as the hourly worker there, nobody was asking any questions about anything, except when they saw the time study guy come around, everybody slowed down, right? I worked as a product manager where I had profit and loss responsibility in an electrical company, and we made things in batches, right? Just because of the nature of the product, but it was higher end, so it certainly wasn't everything to everybody. But if I had an important customer there, it was Boeing, actually, because they ordered a whole bunch of these lights for manufacturing. Picture an airline fuselage or an airplane fuselage with no cabin lights and no seats. What you've got is a big dark tunnel, and they have to run wire and rivet and put the plane together and so forth. So we had lights for that. They didn't mind spending a lot of money on portable lights. But you had to be out there, and they weren't really asking how much this costs. They were more concerned with this holds up. I actually got out there and saw how they used it. They'd lay the lamp down and they'd stand on it. And I said, well, the engineers back at the shop would tell me they're not supposed to. And I said, yeah, but they do. So we have to redesign it so they can. And that's what we did. So, and then I ended up in pharmaceutical manufacturing. I got exposed to that in the 90s. And one of the things I learned was tablet pressing, actually making the oral dose form. Everything in the factory is faster than that in front of it, and everything in the factory is faster than that behind it. So they really needed to focus on how am I going to make tablets differently, not press them faster necessarily, but make them differently. And so now you're talking about innovation, and we actually had a printing technology approach to that we took at Cerna. So, so I've got kind of this discursive collection of experiences with manufacturing that resonates with what I'm hearing. I mean, it's all, how do we coordinate it? How do we make it relate? There's a book, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, that Eli somebody or another, and used Boy Scouts as an analogy.
The Goal.
Who is it?
The Goal. It's Ellie Goldratt. He wrote
Goldratt. Okay.
Goal. Yep.
Thank you. And it was the Boy Scout analogy, where you can only go as fast as the slowest Boy Scout as you're taking a hike. Because so I think of all those things flowing together with what I'm hearing today, and it all squares up. Just over those several decades of and several different exposures to manufacturing over the years.
Right. Well, Mark, don't get Scott going on the Goal. He'll talk your ear off for hours.
Yeah, I had an evangelist expose me to that book to begin with.
Well, we won't go there because I've already been down that path with him before. Okay, so I think we're good. Scott, let's quickly shift to another topic. All right, we've talked about this whole thing around impact analysis and how it can alleviate operational stress in manufacturing environments. What is that?
That's one of the big things that people talk to us about. Number one, they want visibility, right? They want visibility of the load to their capacity. The next thing they want is, I want to be able to simulate different scenarios. So if a customer calls and says they want to move an order up by a week, or they want to add 10% to the order, and the CEO calls and says, hey, can we do it? That today for most companies is a hours long throwing a dart on a dartboard exercise. But there are capabilities that would allow a company to actually simulate the effect of that change. They would know the ripple effect on all the other orders. They would know if they could do it or they couldn't. They would know if they had to, do overtime or outsource or whatever, all the levers that people pull. And they would know the financial impact of each choice. So having the ability to have sort of data-based decision-making around different scenarios, but really fast, helps the people that are making the decision to do it with a whole lot more confidence. And they generally are going to pick the right way to get it done. And there still might be some negative effect of that, but they're going to have it minimized to the point where, they're going to pick and choose who they try to, get to work with them on the downside. But yeah, so that impact analysis is really, I think, very important to companies that are trying to do things with some knowledge about the impact of their decisions.
And so I think what I also hear is this impact analysis, it's a tool. And so it's a tool that you can use efficiently, effectively versus the dartboard, right? Where you don't actually know where the risks are, what the output of that risk is. And what I also hear is that there's a lot of speed involved with this. If I can do impact analysis effectively, that's going to shorten my decision cycle time in terms of where am I going to go? What am I going to do relative to my scarce resource? And it gets back to what Jerry talked about earlier, right? In terms of how I address the needs of customers in a competitive way. So really, really key. Bob, let me focus with you. So your focus is on improving team agility and cultural resilience in business settings. We've been operating in a disruptive business environment for 15 months. Do you have any thoughts, from your perspective, coming out of this incredible time period, what are the things that we should be focusing on as it relates to agility and cultural resilience within this setting?
Yeah, let's keep it within the setting because it's a broader topic. But as far as what we're talking about right now, which is intelligently managing either our project or our production facility, I'm coming at it from the human side, from the agility side. We talked about some of those already. Certainly, the metrics is key. But one of the things that has been touched on in a number of other comments is what is probably potentially the most toxic of these, and that's management style. And it could be just the project manager. I think charismatic was the adjective that you used, Scott. A charismatic project manager can help expedite his or her project through. I've seen it also happen, and it's very difficult for the shop floor when somebody in the C-suite calls, the chief operating officer or the CEO. And so I just made a deal on this client meeting, and we've got to move this through. That can have just such an incredibly negative effect. With a tool that they get that you talked about, Scott, where we can actually do that what if analysis. If we make this addition unscheduled into our schedule, what does it do? If I'm adding this enhancement to this project, what impact does it have? That's very important. But it relies at every level from management for the managers to say, I'm going to change the way I work. I'm not going to use my charismatic brilliance to move things through. I'm not going to badger the workers to get my project up on top. I'm going to basically go back to the system and say, what do the data tell us? And all the way up the line, that has to happen.
Yeah.
We get all the project managers on board. They need to have the support of their boss so that nobody can kind of divert the system into chaos. So I think that's really important. Some of the other fundamentals, and I think most organizations have managed this reasonably well in the manufacturing environment. And that gets back to, are the people, do we have the right staff? Are they properly trained? Do we give them the right tools? All the rest of that. But even on the right tools, you touched on this also, Scott, and this is important, is there's this, the shiny object syndrome where I just talked to the sales guy and they've got this great CRM, they've got this great tool, whatever it happens to be. And wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, to your point earlier, not necessarily. It may not be wonderful. And oh, by the way, when people start seeing automation coming in, they get a little nervous for their job. But the point you made previously, I think the ERP, those systems that are enterprise level systems, which manufacturing would be, have less than a 50% success rate, and millions of dollars are lost. And what you're talking about, Scott, is so much more efficient, so much less expensive, and so much more effective at the back end that it brings back both sides of my coin. People are happy, they're delivering, they want to deliver. Not everybody has everybody wanting to have limited overtime. So, but we heard the story of at least one company where people didn't want to work the overtime so much. But with this approach, we've got both people being happy and the customers.
Yeah.
It's such a great synergy.
Right. Bob, you just touched on something that the light bulb went off in my head, which was we were talking about this whole impact analysis and having that capability within the organization. And it seems like that is kind of like a foundational tool that you want to have, and you want to have it operationally. And the reason being, it seems to me that you referred to somebody, let's say on the shop floor, who doesn't necessarily want to tick off the chief operating officer, right? But if the impact analysis is there, it's available and data driven, then that's almost seems like it's almost a way to even shape behavior of even good managers, even good leaders, within the organization in terms of management style. Would you agree with that or disagree?
I agree with it completely. And it needs to start at the top, where the CEO needs to say, our number one objective, remember I said metrics are to answer questions that address business objectives. We go back to the business objectives. First of all, to your point, Scott, what are we? Are we innovative? Are we customer? Are we low cost? Which one of those three buckets? But then all of our metrics drive from those objectives, so that the chief operating officer will have access to the same tool and say, okay, our number one objective is customer satisfaction, hypothetically. Mm-hmm. And it becomes visible that the people know that they're going to, when somebody calls, the trust then is there that says, I know that I'm not going to get a call from senior management because without them having done the analysis to know this is the right thing to do for us as an organization to be successful. Because even as a shop floor, some guy there for the summer, I want to see the organization succeed, right, Mark? I mean, who wants to work for a company where it's chaos all the time?
Right. It seems like there's a lot of work involved here because if a company's moving down a path that they've been doing for 5-10 years, whatever, right? Just the whole notion, you talked about this before, Bob, where 65% of employees would rather take a new boss over a pay raise. That's pretty telling, right? And so if structurally the business is kind of moving down a path, it's almost like we've got to stop, reassess, and maybe reconsider how we're doing things, as a business to be able to be successful moving forward. And that clearly is a leadership issue, right?
That is leadership, and your point's well taken. In that Huffington Post study that they did, which was 2/3 of employees would rather have a new boss than a pay raise, was very telling. And in order to change that culture, though, everybody up the line needs to feel comfortable with a new normal. If my boss is beating me up on things coming in on time, no matter what, and I get, start the day and the end of the day because my boss is beating on me, and I've got to deal with my department, my organization, whatever it is, I'm going to be hard pressed to push back on one side to keep them doing what I think they need to be doing on the team side. So it has to start at the top. And that's frankly one of the challenges for my business when I'm talking to organizations. One of the questions I ask to the guy or gal at the top, if what we learn indicates that your management style needs to change, are you willing to change?
Yeah. Any thoughts from anybody else here in the group in terms of what's just been shared? Yays, nays, different points of perspective, or are we all kind of in agreement? Okay.
Is it possible for this insider to speak? I heard a client actually say that it changed their culture, getting in control of the workflow. And that was a client of, frankly, On Time Edge. They implemented the tool and everybody is with it, loves it, and it's kind of changed the company top to bottom. It's the language with which they speak. They now have a common set of principles to be guided by, and they're succeeding. I'm talking about JART, Scott, where they say the culture changed. And I just sat in a meeting in Chicago a week ago where a CEO said, our schedulers are shooting in the dark. We're in the fog. They're in a fog. They have no idea whether it's going to flow through or not, the order. And they go out on the floor and count parts. In other words, the data is not there in front of them. So this goes back to Bob about we need to give the people who have to produce the tools and the rationale behind the process. I think a lot of what's left out is the rationale behind the process. They think people won't understand. Well, the hell they won't. They're smart. You hired them. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little into culture here, but treat them like grown-up adults who can take responsibility.
Okay.
They'll help.
Well, Jerry, thank you for that. Scott, here's a question for you. In these sessions, we try and avoid presentation, right, so we can have discussion. But you and I talked the other day around maybe certain examples that could be easily understood around scheduling or project management. Are you prepared to share any of that?
Yeah, I've got a couple of visuals I could show. I mean, I think anybody that's interested, the next.
Let's do it. We've got 20 minutes here, but let's take 10 minutes if we could just do a couple examples.
All
I
right.
think we've got shared screen. Zoe, is that right? Got it. Okay.
Do you see it now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to hit on the two things, the production environment and then the project environment. What causes a lot of the issues? So if you see here, and this is essentially a company that manufactures a finished good, C, and it has two subassemblies, subassembly A and subassembly B. Each work center has a capacity, right? And the demand for the product is 60 units per period. So even though almost every work center can actually produce more than that, the one work center, this one FRG 100, can only produce 50.
So that's the slowest Boy Scout. Is that right?
That's Herbie. That's who he was referring to as Herbie.
Okay.
So yeah, that's the pace at which the organization can generate throughput. And so the key here would be to make sure that that work center does fulfill its capability. I mean, if it actually wastes time and only does 40, that's even worse. But so this is what needs to be managed, is the flow of material through this work center to get out to the customers. That's the basic fundamental of what has to be done.
All right. Now, so before you go on to the next one, Scott, so I'm looking at this, right? And I'm trying to visualize this in my own mind. So that if I'm in a manufacturing environment and I'm trying to drive balance capacity against certain metrics, that says one thing versus balance flow. If balance flow and I'm optimizing against the constraint of Herbie at 50, then what that allows me to do is, if I have working capital build up, raw materials, work in process, all these other workstations, I can effectively, with limited risk, take those inventory levels down, right? I don't need to have them at those high levels. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, because you'd be basically flowing material through at the pace of the drum, you don't push it in just to do 60 because you can do 60 or 80 or 70. You want to push material in so that it supports the creation of 50 units of the key product. Now, these other work centers could potentially be utilized to fulfill other demand. But the fundamental problem is that companies are basically overbooking, and then they're activating resources that aren't really going to contribute anything at the end of the day.
Right.
Okay. So now this is a fundamental reality, right? The issue that we face now, this is a work center, FRG 100. This is the representation of the production orders in that work center for this period of time. You can see on the bottom. So the typical ERP system takes orders based on lead time or available material. And so what happens is, when order entry gets done and they throw it over the wall to manufacturing, this is what manufacturing sees. Go produce all these things on these days and we'll be fine getting the order out to the customer.
So those little green bricks are actually orders for customers.
These are production orders,
right?
That might be satisfying customer orders, multiple customer orders, but this is the batch of work that needs to be done on that work center at that time to be on time. That's why they're all green.
And so the red line is basically my capacity, and then anything above that red line basically is the defined problem area.
Right. Because most ERP systems are only concerned about material, they don't really look at capacity. So this is what happens. You get this kind of demand coming at a work center. So this demand says I would need 20 machines in that work center to actually produce, to process that work, to get it done on time. Okay. I only have 4. So the bottom line is, every day, like I talked about earlier, the production meeting is, who do I take care of and who do I not take care of?
Got it.
Because you can't do them all. It's the 5-pound bag thing, right? Yep. So what you want to do, though, is you want to create through the use of tools, an ability to not overbook. You know what the capacity is. You know what your material availability is. So let's simultaneously test material and capacity, make sure that when we make the promise that we know what we're saying. Now, in this case, we got red orders here. We're saying we're going to be late, but at least we're telling them how late we're going to be and in that particular order. We might even have the ability to say, well, that order is going to be late, but we've got 4 other orders of yours. Which one would you like to substitute? You know, so we can do a lot of things. But the bottom line is, if you overbook your capacity, you got a mess. So you don't want to do that. Now, if I look at this in terms of a real world application, this is a furniture company. So here was the drum. The shaping operation was the drum for them. They were making essentially a single product using metal products and wood products that were being assembled in a product, deliverable SKU for the customer. They were serving different types of customers. And so what they wanted to do was to manage flow through this work center. They had a time buffer. So they were making sure that whatever got released into the system, here's the rope saying, go release material, that would come into the system and hopefully get there, with enough time to kind of do what needed to be done to make sure that we didn't disrupt any of the flow through the constraint. Because if we lose an hour at the constraint, we lose an hour forever. And that's the key. Anything else that you're doing at these other work centers is almost inconsequential, but this is the fundamental thing. So you're committing the market based on the constraint capacity. You're managing the variability through the use of a buffer at the control point and at other places like at shipping potentially. So you guard against weather and things like that. And then you're synchronizing material flow to the pace of the control point. So testing demand, releasing material, making sure it gets through the work center, out to the customer. So that's fundamentally how you do that in the production world. Now, let me just show you one last thing here. If we want to look at it in terms of project management. So if you look at this screen, can you see it?
Yep.
Okay. So on the top here, we have 3 projects and they run, these lengths of time. This is a summary. It's just basically saying these are the different phases of these projects, and the colors just represent how much buffer do I have in that phase to help me deal with the variability. And in the project world, like we said, the variability is so much more than it is in the production world. The production world, it's almost predictable variability. Here, it's not. So what I'm looking at is, here are the projects. Now let's say, and I want to look at what's the load on the capacity that I have. So if you look here, this 0 line, that's what my capacity is. So if I look at a group, if I look at the manufacturing people, they're actually, the load on them is more than their capacity. It's almost, I have 1 FTE that I'd have to hire to actually, satisfy that demand. If I look at the design side, I could see that I've got a little bit of an overload. And then if you look at some of these other groups, they're way underloaded. And the overall load is under capacity, but there are certain departments that are over capacity. And even in a department, I can actually look at the specific resources to see how it's allocated. So that's this current profile, right? Now let's just say I've got the sales guys are out there and they've got, I don't know why that's not going up there, but okay, here we go. Okay, sales guys are out there and they've got these other projects that are coming in. Now, if I want to see what adding this prospect number 3's project in the mix is, I can just click on the plus sign and I can see the impact it's having on the load of that particular skill group. I could either move it up there if I want, or I can start to manipulate this. But the idea here is, before I make the commitment, make sure I understand what the load on my resources is going to be. And then what you see here in the task list, once you've got the schedule established, you would just go to a task list and execute the tasks in the order that they're given to you. And these numbers on the left, this 87 down here, means that I've penetrated the buffer 87% of the way. So I don't have a lot of buffer, but I'm prioritizing the tasks on the amount of buffer remaining in the project. So I'm looking at all projects, all tasks across all resources. And whenever somebody basically inputs time, they say, I've got 5 hours remaining or 10 hours remaining, it real time resequences the workload.
Got it.
So the rule is if I have a personal task list, then I know what's in progress, what I can work on, what's on hold, what's ready to start, and what has been recently completed. So all I want to do is execute what's being presented to me to work on.
Okay, so Scott, just several observations on this. Maybe we can kind of close out of this.
Yep.
This is the example of the impact analysis. If I go back to what Bob was talking about earlier, this is I have a leader, within the organization says I want to do X. Well, everybody wants to make sure that Bob, as the CEO or COO, we want to make sure that he's happy, right? But if I have the tool that allows us to do that kind of analysis, which by the way is not just a spreadsheet or a dartboard, that I can with authority go back to Bob and say, well, boss, I don't know that we want to do that for these reasons, and so that's more targeted, favorable discussion on what we should do or what we shouldn't do. Would you agree with that, Scott?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately it comes down to what are my best options? Somebody has to make a decision. And you know what? It might not be that obvious. Maybe it is an intuition thing on the part of the leader of the company. He knows what to do or she knows what to do and has done it well. But this is just giving them a much better opportunity to make the right decision.
Right. Okay, thank you. Okay, so everybody, we're coming to the close for the session today. I think based on the conversation, achieving a balanced manufacturing flow does indeed represent an opportunity within a high change manufacturing environment. As a next step, what we'll do is we'll provide everyone with a summary of some of the key points expressed in this session, along with contact information should you wish to reach out. Also, Scott and I were talking about this earlier. If either you or a client are interested in a real world demonstration with actual company manufacturing data, we did this a couple months ago, where we can actually do a demo, right, on that. And so please reach out to us and we can discuss that further. Okay. And as a Beacon member and participant in today's session, you're going to receive future updates on Nimble Leader Roundtables, certainly beginning in the fall of 2021. So I would just say stay tuned, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.